like our shoes on the golden ground.
Hi, I'm Kelly Jo Coney-Khan. I'm glad you're here. And this is home, where you come to reset your nervous system and rewire your week. Today's conversation is a little different. I'm joined by Dr. Robert Rhoton, founder of the Arizona Trauma Institute and president of the Trauma Institute International. We're talking about something that sits underneath so many of the struggles people face, but rarely gets understood clearly. Not labels, not diagnosis, not even particularly mental health, but what's actually happening at the core within ourselves, in our families, in our relationships. It is the nervous system. If you've ever felt like you're functioning well on the outside, but something isn't quite settled underneath, or you're trying to do everything right and still feeling disconnected, this conversation will help you see things in a completely different way. Hi, Dr. Robert.
Hello, how are you doing tonight?
Good, thank you. Good. So I wonder if we could start by defining some terms for our audience today, common terms that are used in this work. And what I'll do is I'll go through them one at a time for you.
All right.
Regulation, self-regulation, dysregulation, trauma, chronic and toxic stress, hormones, nervous system. So maybe we could start with regulation.
So regulation is really about the body's being able to stay in a calm enough state so that we can exercise judgment and intentionality. When people become dysregulated because of the way the nervous system operates, it pulls them out of that ability and pushes them into a reactionary process. When you have people that are dysregulated chronically, rather than living intentional lives where they are achieving their goals and they are able to stay regulated and be intentional in their day-to-day lives, they're not. And that brings a lot of people in for treatment. I think I've got both there, regulation.
I think that covers regulation and dysregulation very well. And how about then self-regulation? What would it mean to self-regulate?
Self-regulation, there's actually kind of a better terminology for that, which is self-governance. The ability to experience distress and sit with it long enough to choose responses that are reasoned out. And that's really what when we're talking about self-regulation, is the ability to do that.
And then that brings me to the next one, which would be co-regulation.
Human beings are designed to connect. And, most relationships of any weight in our lives, there's an element where we are co-regulating with each other, whether that's a mother comforting a child or several friends feeling relaxed and bonded together when they're endeavoring to do something. And so that ability to co-regulate is fundamental to quality of attachments, excuse me, the ability to form meaningful relationships that are sustainable for long periods of time. If co-regulation isn't available on a consistent basis, then attachment will be, we'll still have attachments, but the quality of them may not be what we would really like.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Okay, that brings me to the next one. When you say that they might not be the quality that we would like, I think this is a term as well that is really important to define in this work, because often this term can disconnect people, but actually it's a very connected term if we think about it, and that's trauma and complex trauma.
Sure. Most of the time when at least in most of the diagnostic literature, when they're talking about trauma, they mean a single event, something that's acutely overwhelming, of a short duration, and it isn't repetitive. And so, all of the models that are the evidence-based models for treatment are really based on acute trauma. When you are exposed, so you think of it as low frequency, low duration, high intensity. But when you start looking at other forms of traumatic experience, which we call toxic stress, you don't need to you can have intensity, but even at moderate levels of intensity, if you have it happening repeatedly and it lasts for long periods of time, it's actually going to do more damage to your nervous system than the single bad event. So what we find is that complex trauma is really that second kind of experience. It's something that happens repetitively. It's moderately arousing to high levels of arousing. It's happening multiple times. And when it happens, there's no predicting how long it's going to last before there's any relief in the environment. This is fundamentally one of the challenges we have with developmental trauma, which is a form of complex trauma for children. It is also deeply rooted in our failures in society to sustain family bonds, because we have adults that don't regulate themselves very well, that grew up in environments of toxic stress, and all of their nervous system is built to be protective and defensive, and they enter relationships to meet needs, but they're also often not completely available, or they go the other route and are way too clingy. And so it ends up that what feels natural to them because of their lived experience is exactly the thing that costs them a relationship. And quite often these folks are marrying other folks with similar backgrounds and trying to raise kids together, and then wonder why that isn't working terribly well.
This is also reminding me of the pretty awful anecdote that I think a lot of us learn in this work about the frog in boiling water.
Yeah.
Do you think you could share that with the audience? Because I think that would be a way that
That,
people could
that
really
metaphor?
be clear on dysregulation and how to know that they're dysregulated.
Well, I'm going to use a different metaphor than that one.
Okay.
Often when people are in states of toxic stress, their entire nervous system, their entire body is looking for ways to protect itself and defend itself, and to reduce the level of distress that it feels. So I'm going to make a name up, but we're going to call this person Betty. Betty grew up in a home where the parents both had their own histories of toxic stress, and she was often treated with contempt and humiliation. While she wasn't physically abused, she also felt abandoned all the time because neither of her parents were really emotionally available. And because of the experiences she's having, her nervous system is building a set of patterns, and those patterns are directing what feels instinctual to her. So she comes in to see you because she's going through her fourth divorce, and she's 30 years old. And she sees the patterns, but she doesn't know how to really manage them. And that's really because she'll walk into a room, and what she is sensitized to look for, there could be 100 nice guys in the room. She's going to gravitate to the one that is the least available and the most aggressive, because that one is the one that her nervous system recognizes. And so what ends up happening is she keeps selecting partners that are unfortunately not going to meet her needs. She becomes overly clingy to them. They withdraw. She chases them. They withdraw some more. She chases them some more, and they eventually leave her. And she's devastated. So instead of changing her pattern, she doubles down on it. And the next time she's in a room full of people, she's going to find that person that's not good for her fast and quickly and try to connect with them. That's the kind of thing we're dealing with all the time. And I think that's a much better example than, the frog boiling to death in hot water, because this really does have completely, um, practical applications. And that's a lot of times what we're doing is we have to get people regulated well enough that they can choose differently than what feels instinctual to them. And to be able to tolerate that discomfort of trying something new. We as human beings, we don't really like something new. If you don't believe that, see how my hands are right now. Just do this and see how uncomfortable it makes you feel. And this is pretty safe. Imagine that there's risk to this. Now you're, you're really likely to stay where you were before.
Thank you, Dr. Rhoton. Very interesting. This has also made me think about many of the listeners. So many of the people listening are high performing, responsible,
Mhm,
high achieving, doing
mhm.
exceptionally well on paper. How might this show up in families that look fine from the outside?
Well, and that's really a challenge. We have a lot of people are very, very successful in business enterprises and in even academically, and because that makes sense to them. If you're living in a state of chaos as a child, you're looking for order. You get to school and everything is really structured, and you prosper because of the structure. Then you're rewarded for overperforming, and we call that overfunctioning. And what you're trying to do is to control the environment to feel safe, to feel in charge. And quite often, these people are insanely successful in business, but they're not very successful in other areas of their life. And because they overfunction in this one area, they tend to underfunction in other areas of their life. There's not really any balance. And so you find them working 80 to 100 hours a week. They're making incredible amounts of money. Their company loves them because, they bring things in on time, and yet, they're going through multiple relationships that are, destroyed. They may have children, sometimes with several different wives or former girlfriends. They're not really close to most of them. It's just, it is a tragic story. And what we often do is look at the number of toys and the lifestyle they live, and we say, gosh, they're doing well. And the reality is that in one narrow aspect of their life, they're doing wonderfully. Quite often, we end up judging people by what we see rather than what is really going on. You look at celebrities. How often, we only see the public side of them, and we make these judgments about them, and you get to know somebody in person and all of a sudden it's not the same thing. And most people don't want that view. They want the view of it's not really the correct view. So this is something we are always running up against. The other thing about overfunctioners is they tend to be highly vulnerability avoidant. They're not going to be allow much vulnerability in their life, because the moment they allow vulnerability, their body perceives it as a threat. So, it can make a really, really good business person, but that same business person isn't necessarily going to be good as a partner or as a parent, or have much community concern other than how they look to that community.
Yeah. Okay. A lot of what you describe, and yeah, a lot of what you're saying seems to shift the focus away from the child being the problem and more towards the environment. Can you explain that in a simple way for someone listening at home?
Sure. We all anybody that has children recognizes that they each has their own kind of personality, but that personality unfolds in an environment, and the environment is deeply impactful. And a lot of people say, well, I have 4 kids, they're raised in the same environment, and that's just not true. No parent parents all of their children the same way. And um, which is kind of good, actually, because I don't want to be parented in a way that is the same way, my sisters might have been parented. But, this idea that, um, that they have that is just, it's just not correct. And what we didn't have the really good data to support that, even though, common sense suggested that the family of origin has a deep impact on the child for the rest of their life. We had no data to support that until the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And what we found is that these impacts that occurred early in life were affecting people 50, 60 years later. And they looked at basically 10 items, and 5 were ones everybody would agree are horrible: physical and sexual abuse, emotional, physical neglect, and also, excuse me, and also having, um, mental illness in that family. But when you look at there was the other 5, all had to do with family functioning. And what they found was, you have these 10 things. We all as a society everywhere recognize that these 5, they're horrible. But what we tend to ignore is that the family dysfunction was equivalent to this. One of the examples that, your viewers may want to kind of look at is, they use what they call structural equation models to determine how much each thing they're measuring contributes to the whole. The single most powerful producer of long-term health consequences was sexual contact in a minor child. That is all the way up to 18. It's not just something that happens when they're 2 or 3. This is all the way up to 18. And the next most powerful influencer was was really surprising to everybody, because it was only 0.2% less powerful than sexual abuse, and that was parental divorce and separation. And all of a sudden, what we realized is that where we'd always kind of believed that the behavior and emotions we were seeing from people were related to something in their head or in their hearts, it was what we call an intrapsychic. It was some attribute of their character that was causing the problem. But as of 1998, we had data to say that that was a lie. It is how your body is responding to your environment that is building long-term wellness or not. And the environment that is stressful because you have unstable adults, and then you expect a child to be more stable than the adults in their environment, that's such a shame load on children. The schools do the same thing. They want the vulnerable child to bear all of the weight of change rather than redesigning what they do or tailoring what they do to the individual needs of the student, which we all know is better practice. But, then you would have to pay teachers better. You would have to train them better. You would have to have a system that supports them better. And, the power structure of the school system isn't going to go for that. All people in authority, which are the ones in charge of the environments, almost universally want the most vulnerable, the least skilled to do the changing. And that is problematic because what we end up doing, and I'll give you a kind of an example of this. Let's say you have little Billy. Billy lives with his mom and several older siblings. The next sibling to him in age is 6 years older than he is. And his mom works 2 jobs to kind of, trying to make ends meet. And so that means a good deal of the time he is with his siblings. And what they delight in is just harassing him. They ask him questions and then make fun of his answers. And they ask him questions and then tell him how stupid he is. And, you know, and let's be honest, when you're a kid, somebody asks you how a car runs, you just make your best guess. And it can be pretty funny. But when they used it as their primary source of humor and they were picking at him all the time, and what his body learned by experiencing that is here he is now 8 years old. He's in third grade. He had a week off and he spent most of it with his siblings, which were constantly at him. He goes into school on Monday morning. They're a half hour into the day. His body is still in high dysregulation. And the teacher, without any preparation at all, asks him to complete a problem on the board. And he says no. And she cajoles him a little bit, and he still says no. And then she shames him, which gets a big no. And then she sends him to the office for being, uncooperative to be disciplined. And of course, the school disciplines him and says, you need to answer questions when you're asked. And essentially what the school does is then send him to the school counselor. And what the system does is conspire with the power structure to convince this child they are the problem. And the reality is the teacher could have addressed this by simply taking a moment and asking this child if it would be okay to ask them a question and invite them to the front, especially if I make sure that you aren't embarrassed. But they didn't do that. They just wanted compliance and acquiescence. And that's what our structures do. They are not interested in relationship. They're interested in control. And a lot of times we find dysregulated parents do the same thing. And so what we have is a system that blames the weak, the vulnerable, the victim for not being able to perform better, rather than actively creating the environment that would allow them to prosper and be successful. It happens in homes, it happens in schools, it happens in businesses.
If someone
Probably way
hearing
over answer.
someone's hearing this, Dr. Rhoton, and they're resonating, but they're also starting to feel slightly concerned about themselves, their children, their partner, their environment. How would you want them to understand this without turning it to internalized blame, let's say, or shame?
Well, understand that this is a nervous system response. It isn't this, like little Billy didn't sit at home and say, I'm going to be really difficult tomorrow in school. It's not it's not character related. It's the way the nervous system has been built. If your nervous system has been built this way because of what you grew up with, and you've never really been regulated, and you found somebody else that isn't really very regulated, and you're trying to raise children, and you're unhappy and miserable and overwhelmed quite often, um, you know, you're going to have to focus on getting the system regulated first so that you can choose to do something different. And that's not a good, bad, right or wrong. It's just biology. You have to get the biology in order if you're going to be successful and being able to manage yourself.
Thank you for saying that.
It's
I
kind of
think
like if you have equivalent of because of your history, you have the equivalent of a toothache. And every time you have something cold, it hurts. You don't just keep hurting. You figure out what's going on and you fix it. But that's the problem is a lot of folks, they have difficulty fixing things because they are so reactive.
a lot of people, this also makes me think of a lot of people struggle with shame around this though. And I think this is a new concept to hear this as biology, and it's on a spectrum, right? What we know from what we call mental health or nervous system dysregulation, it's really on a spectrum. And what I'm thinking here is if people do have shame around trying to fix their environment, uh, not wanting to seek help, not wanting to go to therapy or do some kind of trauma coaching or trauma work, or let's say for chronic stress, what would you say to these people that are feeling this shame around seeking help or being able to change their environment for reasons like, I don't have time?
Well, let's be honest. We all have time for things that we value. We make time for that. So the I don't have time piece is just a way of saying it doesn't matter. In order to change anything, we have to calm the body down enough to allow people to be intentional, to be self-governing. And they have to be able to do that long enough to build a new neural pathway, a new pattern. Now, that doesn't mean the old pattern is going to go away, but the more you reinforce the new pattern, the more likely it is to be the dominant pattern. But in a moment of stress, you're going to go back to the old pattern. And you have to understand that that's the process. So I might um, work with a family for a while and they're doing really well when they're intentional. But when they get dysregulated, they fall back into old familiar patterns. And anybody that has children has probably done this. You're working really hard to do well with your parenting, and there's a stressful moment, or the culmination of several stressful moments, and you hear something coming out of your mouth you swore you would never, ever say because you know how much it hurt when you were a kid and you heard it, or how angry it made you. And here it comes. It's not going to help. It's not going to help the situation. It's not going to heal anything. And here it comes. Blah, 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 blah. And then after it's out, it's almost like, did I say that? And that's because in a moment of distress, those new neural pathways get forgotten and we go to the old familiar ones. This is one of the reasons that it requires people to practice staying regulated and to be able to, if you want to think about it, is increase their ability to sit with the stress, because change is distressing. We see this tremendous increase in the amount of mental illness that's in society. And what I'm going to suggest, it's really, there's several factors that are influencing that. One is we live in a society that is producing more and more stress all the time. We have these ideals around, well, I have to get more, I have to be more, I have to do more. And it's just like that striving for things that, because that's what social success looks like, is incredibly challenging. And they often substitute that chase for those things in place of satisfying relationships. And so we have, people that are not building relationships with children. What they're doing is, a variety of things, using media as a babysitter. Um, they, in more affluent, they just hire somebody to take care of the kids rather than them building relationships with those children themselves. So what's your next question?
Okay. If a parent realizes that they've been overfunctioning or feeling disconnected or not having enough time with their children or child, what's the first small shift that they could make this week that would genuinely help their child? Just something small.
It's getting control of themselves. Again, a dysregulated parent's going to want the child to bear the burden of change. But the reality is the parent is in charge of the environment. And so them being able to manage themselves even a little bit better will make things a whole lot better for the child.
In this work, we often hear as well stories and situations around adults trying to regulate themselves through their children.
Well, we find a lot of times children get parentified, is the parents abdicated the role, and now you have a child that is expected to kind of take that on. And again, that's incredibly damaging to a child. They aren't equipped to make those kinds of adult decisions. And so what ends up happening is they make bad choices, they get shamed or ridiculed for it, they try to do better, and they become so driven to do this, that it really often destroys their childhood. So again, the very first thing that needs to happen is that the adults, they need to be able to manage themselves and govern themselves, manage their emotions. And we don't live in a society that promotes that. Nobody wants a well-regulated population, because there goes all your consumerism. No one in politics wants a well-regulated population, because then most of them wouldn't have a job. If you're in a grocery line somewhere, no company that sells candy wants you to be regulated, because they want you to make those impulse buys while you're the fifth person in the grocery line. You're not enjoying standing there waiting to check out. And a little bit of arousal is going to trigger a protein change in your nervous system, which is going to trigger the diencephalon. The diencephalon tells you, you're in distress. You need to eat high calorie, high fat foods. You need to do it right now. And so there they are. Those candy bars are there. They're just waiting for you to use them for that purpose. And that's, they make a lot of money on that. Almost everything consumer wise we really bank on people being dysregulated enough to make a purchase. Let's be honest. How many people really need a new car? I mean, there are certainly those cases where they are, or trendy clothes. Everything on our society is designed to keep people dysregulated. So it's a big decision to not live your life that way.
Why do you think it's easier for people to buy a car or a candy bar than it is to seek out therapy?
because it's impulsive. They're making that decision in their impulse system, their dysregulated system. To seek therapy is to, you know, really take on a process of change and transformation that is going to be a lot of work, and it's going to require me to stay present and focused for a long time. If I don't spend much time being present or focused, that can feel like I am at the foot of Mount Everest and I can't even walk a couple of blocks and they want me to climb this thing.
I know a lot of your work at the Trauma Institute has focused around ADHD, and there's a lot of conversation right now around ADHD and around ASD. From your perspective, how much of that is actually about the environment and regulation rather than something inherently wrong or disordered with the child or even the parent themselves?
We have good data on the genetic influence of, and I'm going to start with something that we have the most on, and that's schizophrenia. And we know that schizophrenia is going to appear in a standard population at about 1.5 to 2%, because that's when you start looking at it being, if it's a truly organic genetic problem, it can occur about that much. When it exceeds that much, one of two things are happening. Either the phenotype of our genetic structure is shifting, or we are blaming, we're blaming it on our environmental stressors instead of, really understanding what's going on. So when we have, for example, in the US, about 38% of school-age children diagnosed as ADHD, 38% is significantly above the possibility of genetic, which is basically saying that most of that's environmental. And of course, because the parents aren't regulating very well and the school systems don't want to deal with changing so that they can accommodate kids, they want them medicated. And it's more around pacifying them so that they don't have to change. Um, and that's really, really unfortunate. So, when you start looking at 8% of children being diagnosed, by middle school being diagnosed as bipolar, you have, any psychiatric disorder, we're basically assigning a disease to these folks for basically being in a dysregulated body and assuming that the problem is they are the problem rather than the environments that they're in are triggering this biological response. And why aren't we changing the environments? And of course, nobody really wants to hear that because the adults and the power structure do not want responsibility. They want it to be all of that weight going on the child. And so, if you look at organizations like the Oregon Social Learning Center, which has been doing ADHD research for almost 40 years, study after study after study after study, and these are well-designed studies, suggest that if you really want to help ADHD, you stabilize the caregiving system. And but you have parents that grew up in their own stressful, and they've never regulated themselves much. They're very reactive. They're very impulsive. They don't know how to really attach to people well. And so they don't know what else to do but go to somebody and say, give my kid a drug. And that change process has to start with them managing themselves. Well, that's, if I'm 35 and I've never been regulated a day in my life, that feels overwhelming. And it's, and it's defensive for me to want the child to do the changing, because as long as I focus on them, like, "Phew, I don't have to do anything." And it's not malicious on their part, it's defensive.
Yeah. And I wonder as well if we could describe a little bit so that people can really understand this piece. For under functioning and over functioning, what would be some examples in an environment of where people would be dysregulated for an under functioner and for an over functioner? What would you give us some examples of this?
So, basically when you're talking about overfunctioning, you're talking about being over engaged in aspects of trying to control your life. Underfunctioning is being disengaged, trying to avoid having to control your life. And so those are two very different aspects of it. They're both dysregulation, but one is the overfunctioner is praised by society. The underfunctioner is labeled as lazy or unmotivated, or we have all sorts of character related labels that we give the underfunctioner. They're both operating that way out of self-protection. And so when you have an example of an underfunctioner, um, you get the, let me give you an example that might be really illustrative. So I had a foster family they had fostered a family unit, 4 children, and they wanted um, these kids to behave differently than they were. I'm putting that kindly. The kids had been in several different placements. If this one didn't work, they weren't going to keep them together. So we are trying to explain to them that the kids can't be any more regulated than you are. And what they expected they'd be able to do with these 4 kids is raise them like they had their own children. And we had to explain, you had a connection with your children that you don't have with these children. So where you could, use your relationship to help your biological children navigate difficulty, you don't have that relationship with these folks. And it just feels like you're trying to control them. And they really wanted the 3 boys, to change. The middle child in that group was a girl, and they loved her. But this is the difference. Overfunctioners can be aggressive and hostile, and they will fight to have control of an environment. And that's what the boys were doing. The girl would come home from school. She would go directly to her room. She would stay in her room until dinner. She would eat dinner. Then she would go back into her room until she went to bed. So basically, she was under functioning. And in that situation, that's what the foster parents wanted from all of the children. And so you had an underfunctioner, and they said, she's great, we love her. But what they don't understand is underfunctioning has what we call a lethality index. Or the underfunctioner is more likely to take their own life, more likely to injure themselves. They're more likely to be attracted to compulsive behaviors. They're more likely to become involved in addiction than the overfunctioner. But they are not creating distress because of their withdrawal. And in situations like I'm saying in this particular foster case, the parents wanted all of these children to be like her. And they praised her. She's wonderful. We love having her. But she'd already began to experiment with cutting herself. And this is a downward path, because she can't be isolated all the time and not have supportive relationships and be successful. And eventually the family said, well, this is just too much work for us. And basically it was, they were willing to keep her, but they did not want those overfunctioning boys. And Child Protective Services didn't really ask them to change. They just moved the kids somewhere else.
I can hear how concerning this would be to listeners who are parents. And if a parent feels like they might have already missed it or things have gone a bit off track, is repair still possible? What would it look like?
First of all, you know, relational breaches can be healed. It requires intentionality on the part of the person that is often responsible for the breach in the first place. But the other thing is that people that are not regulating very well, they want instant results. And that they'll try something, it doesn't work, they give up. And when you have dysregulated parents, part of what needs to happen is that whoever they're working with needs to be not only patient, but encourage them. Essentially what they're doing is they want to be able to do one or two things. They want the therapist or the coach to give them an intervention that will fix things. And it's not. When you're looking at this, as the helper, you have to be able to sit with their overwhelm without you being overwhelmed. And you have to help them navigate it in small steps. It's much like, I don't know how many listeners have had children trying to learn a musical instrument, but one of my children wanted to learn how to play an instrument. And when they were practicing it, it sounded quite a bit like strangling ducks. And you couldn't even tell what they were trying to play. Now they eventually got better, but it took time and it took consistent practice. And it took practice that they did on purpose with full intentionality. And that's the key, is you need to work with somebody that can help you stay intentional, to stay deliberate for long enough to build a new pattern. And that's what's going to be necessary to heal breaches.
Earlier, you spoke about this being intergenerational. How do we break that pattern without feeling like we have to fix everything at once?
Well, again, if you're an overfunctioner, you are built, you need to take action and have it work right now. And unfortunately, we have a lot of that in society where, people will try something, it doesn't work. Instead of reframing it or trying it a different way, they just say, oh, it doesn't work, throw their hands up and, give me something else to do. But most of this requires practice on an ongoing basis. So and a lot of the folks never have really had success in relational connections. I mean, they've had friends, they've had, done well at work, but as far as intimacy, real attachment and commitment, they struggle with it. And so, this is really about getting to the place where you are patient enough to engage in this process, which is going to take time. And so for the helper has to understand that these people don't have any hope that it can be different, because every experience that they've had is confirmed that this is the way things are. And so you have to help them have small little successes over a period of time so you can build a momentum. Unless people can hope, which, and maybe that's not a good term to use here, but unless they can dissociate from this moment and imagine something better and believe that it's possible, they're never going to have the energy to do that. So you have to have an adequate amount of hope to have an adequate amount of energy to take action. So a lot of times people can muscle their way into taking an action once or twice. But that's not going to be adequate. It is really muscling the power to stay in that process until a new pattern is built. New patterns can take a while to build. And you're only dealing with one pattern. Most families that have intergenerational trauma have tons of these patterns running in the background. And to work on pulling one out and changing it, it will impact others, but you still have plenty there that's, it's something that if I wanted to change this for my children, I'd have to start when they're young and be consistent for a long period of time. And you almost always are going to need to have access to more than your own household. If you, if I'll give you an example. This is kind of a funny story, but so a young couple they meet, they date for a little while, they get married. The first holiday comes around, they're still in college, they don't have time to go home. So they do their first holiday together, and the husband's watching her make this Christmas meal. And he goes, "Why are you cutting the end off of that ham?" And she says, "Because that's the way you make a ham." And he goes, "Well, why?" "Because that's the way you do it." Okay. you know, uh, and that's what happened the several years they were left in college. After college, one of the first holidays they got invited to, the family at large, was a Christmas meal. And he's there in the kitchen watching it, his wife and his mother-in-law and several other relatives making dinner. And the mother-in-law takes the ham out and she cuts the end of it off. And he asks her, "Why do you cut the end off the ham?" And she says, "Because that's the way you make a ham." And he's like really perplexed. 8, 9 years go by. Same thing every holiday that there's they do something the same way. And after almost a decade, there's a family dinner, and his wife's grandmother is the one that's actually preparing the meal. And of course, she doesn't cut the end off the ham. And he goes, "Why don't you cut the end off the ham?" And she goes, "Well, why would I do that? It's wasteful." And he goes, "Wait a minute. You don't cut the end off your ham, but your daughter and granddaughter and my wife's sisters do the same. Let's get them in here and figure this out." So they come in, and the daughter says, "Well, that's the way my mom taught me." And the mom says, "Well, that's what I grew up with." And the grandmother goes, "I used to cut the end off the ham because I didn't have a big enough pan for it." And they're all like,
Great story. Great example.
and that is how family patterns build. They're not usually conscious choices. They're observed behavior that has become habituated. And so there are a lot of things we're just doing because that's what's been handed down to us. And when we get to the place where we're regulated enough to be intentional, all of a sudden it feels like life is so much work because we haven't been intentional. We've just been running on patterns.
Yeah, that actually brings me to the next question. In places like Singapore, where children are often raised with helpers, what should parents understand about attachment and connection in that dynamic, Dr. Rhoton?
Well, you've got quite a mix of different cultures, and you've got a strong Indian presence, you've got a strong Malay presence, you've got a strong Chinese presence, and a bunch of other folks mixed in. But those are the three primaries. One of the things that I see in the Singapore culture is that you have a lot of the Asian parents are what we call unrelenting standards environments. In other words, You are supposed to make your family look good, your parents look good. You are supposed to do, what they suggest you should do. And what I find a lot of times in Asian families, the kid comes home with a report card and they have 6 classes. 5 are A's and 1 is an A minus. The A's are not going to get any attention at all. That A minus is like the end of the world. You're a failure. Look, you didn't get an A. You're a failure. And I see that pattern, and it's something that goes deep in that culture. These unrelenting family dynamics go back generations. And it is, we did some work a number of years ago with 3 universities in China that were having a significant number of students attempt suicide. Between these 3 universities, I had about 100,000 students, and they had about 4,500 suicide attempts. When we when we were looking at the data, what we found was you had a significant number of students that were in majors they weren't interested in because those are the ones their parents picked. And because it wasn't important to them, they found it really incredibly hard to be successful at it, and they weren't making the grades that they wanted to make. And rather than being able to say to their parent, I don't like this, I want to do something different, they would rather kill themselves than to admit that they just couldn't have that conversation. That's an unrelenting family standard. And I see it in a lot of affluent families. I see it in some of the Asian cultures. I also see it in some of the other cultures around the world. And it is a cultural family dynamic that is incredibly stressful. So you have a lot of influence from those that are Indian. They do much the same way. They have a lot of expectations put on their children. And quite a lot of times the expectation they have is that the kid will grow up and take care of the parent. And that's instead of doing it out of love because they love and have a good relationship with this parent and they want to take care of them, the expectation is you owe it to me to provide for me in my later years. And that's also quite damaging. And I really can't address the Malay culture there in Singapore because I'm not as intimately familiar with them, but there's a lot of communal, you aren't supposed to do things that bring shame to your family or your community, which sometimes can be, it lets things that need to be addressed go unmentioned for generations.
Aren't there some studies that show that kids who don't do so well in school, compared to those who get all A's, can even be more successful than the kids who get all A's? Aren't there some studies that show that these kids as adults can become more successful or as successful?
Yeah, Carol Dweck is? She looks at mindset. And one of the things she's got a lot of research behind it now at this point, that often the successful child becomes really concerned with being seen as successful. And so as they become successful, they become less likely to experiment or take chances. And they want to be validated for what they already can achieve. And in fact, one of the things she said is if you deeply reinforce someone's success, you actually are going to cause them to have a more limited mindset. And that if you praise effort, Carol Dweck is a psychologist that does research on this. And It's very fascinating. And one of the things she suggests is we stop attaboying success instead of what we should be doing is focusing on effort. But status comes with, I mean, everything in our society is not about, you know, effort. It's about, if you're smart, you do this. And if you're smart, you do that. If you're successful, you do what you're good at. Well, that's great as long as what you're good at is something you can earn a good living over. But what if you have to be innovative? Innovation is one of the most difficult things companies struggle with because they hire people that have this mindset that they're going to do what's familiar to them because it's worked for them, and they aren't going to be innovative.
Thank you, Dr. Rhoton. As we come to the end of this very interesting conversation, I wonder if you could leave families with one shift in perspective that would or could change how they raise their children. What would that be?
Well, I think one of the very most important things is that parents that have a history of their own dysregulation need to look at themselves with grace and realize that they didn't wake up one morning and decide this is something that developed over time and that it will require time to change and help them understand that this is built in your nervous system. This biological responsibility is, you know, it's going to take you time to get that body regulated and to choose differently and be patient with yourself and kind to yourself and, treat yourself with an amount of grace. And if you can't do that, you're not going to be able to sustain change.
So, taking out the shame and the judgment.
Well, and in our society, we love shame, you know. Um, it's one of the things that I'm always talking about educators need to eliminate. But they love it, you know. They try to shame people into compliance. Parents use shame to gain compliance. And, but there isn't any evidence that shame actually creates any kind of positive change.
I just have to get one last thing in because this is so interesting just before we finish. What do you think of the terms good behavior and bad behavior in children?
So you have a kid that is growing up in a fairly toxic stress environment. Their whole system is wired for safety, preservation, and to manage just survive it. So they go to school, their body's still in that aroused state, and it will be for hours. And some kid looks at them, and that look is very similar to the one that they get from other family members just before they get their butt kicked. And so here's this kid, isn't intentionally looking like that, but they look like that. And now the kid is fully ready to defend himself, pops up and punches the kid. Well, now he's on his way to the office to be punished for that behavior. And the school is really concerned about keeping the environment safe. But the reality is that that's a biological response. It's not, this kid didn't walk into the classroom and say, well, today I'm going to hammer little Billy in the face. No, it isn't that. And with children, we often are giving them bad behavior labels for what is essentially a biological response. If cortisol levels increase even small amounts, one of the very first things that's going to happen is the musculature of the middle ear will constrict, and they're not going to be able to process language very well. And when do parents want to have a conversation with their child is when the child and they are upset, which guarantees that the child cannot hear it or follow directions because they can't process it. And then you have parents say, oh, I've had this conversation 50 damn times and this kid just isn't getting it. And the kid's a bad kid. No, the kid is not a bad kid. The kid is a dysregulated kid in a nervous system that's designed for protection. And you're not calming the situation enough to make it safe for him to take any other stance.
I just wonder, Dr. Rhoton, if just before I go ahead and read the outro, I just wonder if we could leave the listeners with one short message of hope to take away from this whole conversation.
Well, since we know that a lot of this behavior is biological in nature, we need to spend more of our attention and more of our time in getting people in a regulated state. And if we can do that, we can accomplish all sorts of things. But until we can do that, we're going to struggle. And most people don't spend much time being regulated. And that's unfortunate, because if they're reactive, they're not really in control of their life. And what I hope for everyone is that they can be in charge of themselves.
This is home, a place to reset your nervous system and rewire your week. If something in this conversation landed for you, just notice that. You don't have to change everything at once. Small shifts in how we relate, how we listen, how we show up can change far more than we realize over time. Next week on Home, we'll continue exploring how small daily shifts shape the way we feel, connect, and function in an episode called Staying with Yourself When You're Triggered. And coming soon, more conversations like this, where we bridge what we understand clinically with what actually helps in real life. Thank you, Dr. Rhoton, for your time today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
The world is a wondrous place when you slow it down. Throw off the rules like our shoes on the golden ground, and sway in the autumn breeze. You are beautiful when you look at me. Can you feel my love?